Over to you.
Thank you, and welcome all of you to this session. The hope is that we will, with the questions that will come up, be able to address some of the needs, that your questions will give us insights to areas that we need to provide support as people intend to marry or support those who are married too. The sessions are connected to each other. Tonight we'll be talking about marital union in an age of individualism, which will translate to next week's session, In Search of Diversity, What Lies Ahead for Marriage. And then the third week will be marriage more than a covenant. And then lastly, we'll look into insights from John Newman to help us understand why marriage is so objective and so important. And we can't just leave it the way we feel or the way we think. So tonight on this topic, marriage in an age of individualism, I will have 4 definitions that will play part in our discussion. The first is to define marriage in the context of this discussion as a partnership of a whole life between a man and a woman who cherish their individuality, not threatened or afraid of their individuality or the individuality of each other, but work together to flourish in their individuality. I'm very specific in the terms that I used in that definition. And then the second definition will be culture, defining it as a way of a people that is appropriated by individuals who knows that culture is more than speaking a language, but it tells how concepts are interpreted, appreciated, what they eat and how they even eat, and so on. And then the third definition will be individual as a single human person, as distinct from a group or a class. And then lastly, we define individualism as a social ideal that favors absolute freedom of action for an individual over an objective control of action or will. Because this will form why individualism as a cultural ideal pose a challenge to marriage as an institution. Because culture as a way of a people that is appropriated by an individual conditions how people respond to things, to values, and to ideals. So the question we will be asking in this discussion will be whether an ideal such as individualism, in which the self is the main form of reality, is sustainable, especially as it regards to an institution that is selfless and self-emptying. That is a question that we will be thinking as we go through this. Robert Bellah, in his work, The Habits of the Hearts, remarks, he says, what is at issue is not simply whether self-contained individuals might withdraw from the public sphere to pursue purely private ends, but whether such individuals are capable of sustaining either a public or a private life. If this is the danger, he recommends, perhaps only the civic or public biblical forms of individualism, that is, the form that see the individual in relation to a larger whole, a community or a tradition that are capable of sustaining genuine individuality and nurturing both public and private life. You know, the question is asking is not, in the context we're talking about individualism, is a person, an individual that sees himself as the end the source and the end of all he sees in himself and how he relates. That has become the center of his judgment and his relationship. So you see that marriage is still one of those ideals that is approached and lived based on the cultural realities of a people. Because of the prominence of the cultural, individualistic cultural ideal, it poses a lot of challenge. And people, when they don't understand the dynamism or the tension going in between them with the desired need and how the attractiveness of the individualistic lifestyle, they either dismiss, deny, or give wrong interpretation to their needs. So that's why you see a lot of forms of lifestyle coming up, because people do not understand what is playing out in the cultural realities of the time, that they begin to misinterpret and misrepresent what they truly desire. So individualism as a cultural reality in the United States show how different marriage in America is from most European nations or African nations. Because you see that in the US, there are more movements. People move, and as they move, they lose some sense of community and family support, that they begin to turn into themselves to form ideals and mechanism to defend and to actualize themselves. And without knowing that, it begins to form a reality that they cannot navigate through when it comes to that basic need for relationship. So we see the tension between marriage as a desired institution to raise a family and individualism as a sought after means for self-satisfaction. Because that's the goal of individualism, is to self-satisfy in one's own terms with absolute freedom that does not give room for responsibility. So it goes for the right, but not the responsibility or the obligations. So we see Andrew Challen in his book called Marriage Go Round. He talks about culture often containing multiple inconsistent ways of viewing the same reality. An individual choose sometimes without even realizing it, which view to adopt. And that is what is playing out in our lives. People seek and desire relationships, but they lack the capacity to give in what it takes to sustain it, because they have adopted a view that suits their need at that point. So we see that in the midst of these tensions, for some people, marriage now becomes a way to live an adult life. You know, when you grow, the next thing to do is to marry, nothing else. And for some, it becomes the right thing to do. For some, they think it is what everyone does. While some people think that they have to marry or be in some sort of relationship. Yet, without questioning, is the capacity to sustain that relationship there? Or is it clouded by a tendency that does not support that kind of relationship? So we see how individualistic cultural ideal has strong impact on the traditional meaning of marriage today, as Andrew Challen again talks about American cultural model of marriage. But he goes on to suggest that marriage is the best way to live one's family life, and it should be permanent, loving relationship, that a marriage should be a sexually exclusive partnership, and that divorce should be a last resort. These are elements that are still upheld by many today. But individualism, especially expressive individualism, has redefined what marriage implies. And a little bit of history here. Before the 19th century, the values of marriage as a desired way to raise family, it's nothing, nobody talked about it because it's something everybody knows and believes and work for. But the 19th century came with a new wave in cultural models where exploration, sexual revolutions, and a new discovery and expressive individualism that flourished as many people sought to explore their sense of self. So you see that in the quest to explore, marriage and intimate relationship seek to see self-development and personal satisfaction as a key reward of an intimate partnership. So you see the multiplications of subsequent and consequent cohabitation, because it's a reward to me without any responsibility to anything or to anyone. And once that stops, I move on to another. So there came expressive alternatives to self-actualization, that marriage in itself even became desired, but without its components. So people desire some sort of relationship or partnership, intimate partnership, but without the components, which are children, permanence, commitment, exclusiveness. And those are the challenge and the tension that exist, that makes marriage as a covenant between a man and a woman open to creation, procreation, and education of children, challenged by a cultural model that sees self-development and satisfaction as a reward. So there is no longer room for sacrificial love, selflessness, self-emptying, the giving of self, the alignment to help each other. Remember the definition, the flourishing of the two individuals without being afraid of losing oneself, or losing one's identity. But understanding that the union that has become a covenant is not going to take anything away from you, but rather helps you to flourish in the manner, in the way we are all created. So the rights of the Catholic Church, Volume 1, clearly states that Christian couples, therefore, are to strive to nourish and develop their marriage by undivided affection, which wells up from the fountain of divine love. In a merging of human and the divine, they remain faithful in body and in good times as in bad. Individualism does not have the capacity to strive to nourish with undivided affection, since the key reward in a relationship is not mutual self-development, but personal satisfaction. So it becomes difficult to approach marriage with the attitude of giving and accepting love and mutual growth. It becomes self, and that gives room to divorce, gives room to cohabitation as an impact of this. So we'll see that this individualistic mindset not only become a challenge to marriage as an institution, it poses a question to the components of marriage, and then begin to question why marriage has to be a partnership of a whole life, and why one should even worry about children, since intimate relationship is to serve the self and not to care for one another. So I will summarize here so that we can have time for the questions. But there are 4 areas that I've brought out as the why individualism is a challenge to the sacrament of marriage. Number one, marriage is a permanent union. Individualism pursues personal satisfaction, which makes it temporary. Number two, marriage enjoys exclusiveness. Individualism does not. It goes for what satisfies the most. Marriage is a partnership of a whole life. Individualism believes in self-development in one's own terms and self-satisfaction as a reward. Number four, marriage involves commitment to each other, but individualism is only committed to the limit the self is satisfied.